Sadaka Cash, and one of the DEIB co-leads at TNT. I am a therapist, working as a therapist right now in digital mental health. Um, and I've, you know, haven't tried to incorporate kind of like DEI and cultural competence like into my clinical work. And this is the first time though that I've had kind of like a role, a specific DEIB role. So that's kind of like where I am in my journey professionally as it relates to that. Mike?
Yeah, my name is Mike Valdez, and I've been working in tech for about 15 years. I'm actually currently going back to school to get my master's in counseling psychology. I'm about a third way through my program on a licensure track to become an LMFT in the state of California. And yeah, I'm a co-lead along with Sadaka. And for me, it's just a interest as a sort of first generation person of color in the United States, just sort of the sort of impacts that I've seen that DEIB has had on me throughout the sort of journey of my tech career and wanting to engage and learn more about that. And also just seeing how it evolves as I transition into like the mental health and tech space.
Awesome.
Do you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah. So just before, we'll be asking you a lot of questions, but just kind of briefly letting us know, like maybe your role, your title of your role, and like what you're doing.
So I'm Kathy Blau, obviously. I am a licensed clinical psychologist who during the pandemic got incredibly burned out and needed a career change. So still licensed, still can practice, not currently practicing, haven't practiced since last November. I switched over to a tech position last November at an aerospace company. And with that transition, I actually, when during my interview, I wanted to go into organizational development. They didn't think I had enough business experience, so they started me in recruiting. It took about 7 months before they moved me over to organizational development, and that is where, I'll answer, like when I answer the first question, it'll have all like a whole bunch of background. So that's just very briefly.
Okay. And what did you say your title was right now?
Organizational development specialist.
Okay. So you were kind of starting to touch on kind of like your transition from clinical work to what you're doing now. So could you just give us a little bit more details about what that journey has been like? Sounds like working from home and like COVID really kind of jump started that piece for you. But tell us about that kind of your professional journey into this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my sort of journey into DEIB when I was in training as a psychologist. I think every program incorporates pieces into what they do, or like every single class, et cetera. But I really dug deeper when I started my clinical internship. It was the first time I was really introduced to like concepts around power and privilege in a more detailed and reflective sort of way, learning more about myself and my own privilege and what that means. And I would definitely say working in college counseling it's a very social justice oriented space. So there were a lot of continued conversations during, the time that I worked in college counseling. And then I've been back and forth in various settings. There were settings I worked in where it wasn't addressed at all. And like, I would be the person to bring it in and say, during like a case consultation and say, hey, FYI, that's a microaggression. Let's talk about that. And how do you address that with your client when you make a mistake like that? Folks in settings where it wasn't like talked about, it wasn't always very like easily received. I went back into college counseling for the last 3.5 years. I was in college counseling. That's when things really intensified, I would say, especially after George Floyd was murdered. And we were constantly having conversations around social justice, systemic discrimination, power and privilege. racism, everything that was happening in the media, and how do we support our students, and how do we support each other as a staff, but also how do we work on ourselves so that we can do that work, and have enough self-awareness so that we're not making a ton of faux pas in the work that we're doing, and so that we can really connect with our clients. So it's something that, and I'll talk about my intersecting identities as a in number 10, but like for me as a Jewish but also white individual, and someone with chronic health concerns, I mean, if you like looking at any identity wheel, which has sort of various very specific different types of identities on it, there are areas where I have privilege and there are areas where I do not. Specifically being Jewish has been a big piece of like that makes me feel passionate about working in the DEI space, because I have had a lot of experiences of discrimination, experiences of feeling unsafe because of my identity, especially around like our major holidays and going to synagogue with police officers outside the door, and things that have happened locally in this area as well that have been pretty upsetting to me. And so I think that has really pulled me in, especially, and also the piece of like, there's a huge piece around transgenerational trauma. It's pretty much like the entirety of Jewish culture is characterized by that. So those pieces, I think like those personal pieces really pulled me in. So when I switched careers, it wasn't something I wanted to drop. It wasn't something I was willing to say, oh no, I'm not doing that anymore because I'm not a psychologist. It's something that I felt passionate about, and it's a huge value. And so when I started working in aerospace, I jumped in, and we had someone in charge of that. She basically ran our DEI efforts, and she's now my lead. She was the person who was in organizational development, and I was like, please let me get involved. How can I help? How can I jump in? And so I eventually started getting involved in projects with her. We wrote our company's DEI statement by getting the voices of every employee that wanted to participate. So we literally asked a question of everyone. We sent it out to the whole company. We got those responses, and then we used those to come up with themes and a diversity and inclusion statement for the whole company. And so I've continued that work. I've moved over since to organizational development. So I'm working with her directly, and we co-lead our inclusion council. And we have several employee resource groups that are part of that. We also have several subcommittees that are working on various projects. So I work on that. I bring different activities that we can do into the group to help increase our own self-awareness, and learn about topics that may not have been addressed, especially for folks who were never in that space. I think in the psychology space, it's sort of integrated into the work we do. And when you're working with people one-on-one and doing therapy, it's so important that we be able to acknowledge diversity, because it's a part of someone's life, and it's a part of their lived experience and who they are. And it helps us to, understand a person and see them fully for who they are. Aerospace engineers don't get that education at all. Like none of them. So it's exciting work to do because I have that background and that education, and I can jump in and be like, I have this experience, let me jump in and help. So that's how I got into the space. Sorry.
No, so what is that like, kind of, because you're kind of talked about responsibilities, you're like rolling through these well, making our jobs kind of easier is asking the questions, but what is it like, engaging in these topics with folks who might not have already been having some of these conversations for years and years and years? How has that been different than working in the psychology space?
There's no informed consent to some extent, right? Like when we are in the field, right, we're psychologists or LMFTs or LCSWs or LPCs, counselors of any kind, we have informed consent. We go into this knowing DEI is important in order to be effective as therapists, we need to learn about this, and we need to be, I know competence was the word that was being used, but competence suggests like that it's something you achieve and you're done. What was the word that, oh my gosh, I had a better word for it, because it's like, it's something that you're constantly doing, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, just the other words that I've heard, there's like sensitivity, humility.
Yep.
What are some others? Those are the ones that stand out to me.
Yeah.
Top of my head.
For sure. Absolutely. And so like that's something that we're constantly aware of, right? It's something we're constantly educated about, and something that we're constantly educating ourselves about, and we're talking about it, and we're looking at our blind spots, and we're willing to take a look at ourselves, because taking a look at ourselves is part of the work. Right? I mean, even when we're talking about transference and countertransference, right? Like we have to look at ourselves in order to be effective therapists.
Yeah.
Aerospace engineers, people in the tech field without that background may not necessarily, and some of them may, right? Some of them may have been to their own therapy, right? But that might be separate from work. That's like, this is me at home, and I'm willing to do some work on myself at home with my therapist. This is me at work. I'm not doing interpersonal like work, intrapersonal work at work. I'm doing technical work at work. And so there's no buy-in. And the buy-in is a lot harder to get. When you're working with therapists, buy-in is easy, right? When you're working, even when you're working with clients, right? You get informed consent from your client. You mention, I'm going to ask some questions about this, and here's why they're important. And if you don't feel comfortable answering any of these questions, that's totally fine. Let's talk about why, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about what makes these questions uncomfortable. I can't approach it in that way with folks. And so I think there's been a lot of resistance around, these are uncomfortable topics. I think we're focusing way too much on culture, or Pride Week has absolutely nothing to do with the work I do. Why are we talking about this? When our value is cohesion, right? As an organization, people still bring up these questions, right? And it has everything to do with cohesion, actually. Like if we can better understand experiences of folks who are different from ourselves, then we can work with them better, right? We can have a better product. I mean, like all of the research shows more product, faster product, right? Bigger dividends, companies make more money, they're more efficient when they have people who are working together and understanding their identities. And I don't think people quite understand that, because when you go to school for aerospace engineering, and we have way more employees than just aerospace engineers, but when you go for something like that, for example, they don't say, hey, diverse workspace is the way to be, and here's how you need to be in a diverse workspace. Like, here's the competencies or the things that you need to learn about, the things you need to know about yourself, or you need to be able to, for example, have difficult conversations with people. Take a look at yourself, understand things. There are things that will be uncomfortable, things that we all learned in our training as therapists, right? You're going to have difficult conversations. This is going to be uncomfortable. Your first time being called out in group is going to be uncomfortable, and you need to be ready for it, right? Like, so that, I think that is the biggest challenge, is like the differences in buy-in and the education that we're receiving from the get-go versus the education that that they have received from the get-go.
Right. Like your kind of baseline is different. Everybody has different, maybe levels of awareness, but also willingness to like engage and learn about the things that you guys are bringing up. What would you say is kind of like the biggest misconception about what an organizational development specialist does, or someone with a DEI role, maybe in a tech space, that a place that isn't maybe already focused on social justice and things like that? Like, what is something that you think people think they know about this work, but is maybe not completely true or real in your work?
I've gotten a couple like reactions. Well, first and foremost, we don't have a dedicated, like our title is the dedicated DEI folks. I think there are people who have those titles, which I think is really important and awesome, like to be the VP of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. amazing when that happens, because you get a different level of sort of respect and visibility. And in organizational development, I think some of the misconceptions or things, so you have anything from like, oh, they're doing the fun work, or stay away from them. Like your team's in trouble and you need the org dev team to come in and help you out and communicate with each other better, or work with each other better. I remember we had a team build the other day and everybody was calling it group therapy. I'm not sure if that's because they knew I was a therapist or not. Like I didn't actually know some of them very well, but they were calling it group therapy, and I was like, very tempted as a therapist to like ask, like, let's talk about this. I did not.
Yeah. Let's process
But
what you're experiencing right now.
exactly. Like I very much wanted to jump into that. Like, what, tell me about this discomfort that's happening. Let's lean into it.
Yeah.
But so there's sort of that sentiment around it, right? Like there, I think there's a lot of demystification that needs to happen and around like what our work is and what we do, because I think another piece is like people think numbers. We're here to increase the numbers. We want more diverse workforce. We want more people of color on the workforce, right? Like that's not how it works. If you don't have a safe space, an inclusive space already set, and things your company can demonstrate that they are showing that they're doing, you're not going to get those numbers, right? Like if you start doing the internal work, you absolutely will get those numbers. It might take time, because doing the internal work is essentially going to take time, right?
Right.
But you can't just start recruiting for numbers.
Right.
You have to start internally. And I think that's a big misconception, is just like, it's just about numbers.
Yeah, because even if you are recruiting more diverse individuals, if you, like you're saying, the space isn't inclusive, or if one where folks feel valued, they're not going to stay, right? So then you got people leaving, and so that doesn't look good for your numbers if that's the thing that you're focused on or wanting to improve. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's concerning too, right? Because if you get those folks in and they don't see themselves represented in the company, right? Whoever that individual is that gets hired. And they don't feel welcomed and they don't feel included. Right? That's not a good space to be.
Yeah.
And that's our fault, right? For focusing just on numbers. So my colleague and I really are trying to focus on, what are we doing internally? How do we fix internal before we focus on external?
Yeah. Yeah. And because I think too, with different types of roles, like at some companies, like for those companies that have like specific DEI roles, some of those are in like HR or people. There might be kind of in different areas or parts of the company. And so they might have different focuses. And where so some might just be focusing on the numbers and the recruiting, and others may be doing more internal work, or some are doing like all of those. I think, you want to be doing all of those things probably to kind of the way that you're looking at things. But yeah, I think that kind of varies too based on the company, like what the focus is and what they're looking to achieve from engaging in this work.
Absolutely. And we separated our inclusion committee into, we meet together as a whole, but we separated it to 5 subcommittees: attract, recruit, onboard, develop, and culture. And so we're focusing on like the entire employee life cycle, as opposed to just like one piece, right? So this is helping us to make sure that we're covering the whole span, as opposed to focusing just on numbers, focusing just on getting people in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You got to do it all, which is a big undertaking,
It's huge.
But yeah, super important. So kind of on the other end of things, how would you describe like the most rewarding parts of your job and of doing this kind of work?
One of the, I think one of the most rewarding pieces is being able to do something that I value. And when it's like well received. So for example, when I go into an inclusion council meeting and we have a discussion about intersectionality and what that means and what different intersectionalities folks hold and how that impacts them. And people are jumping in and they're talking and they're engaged and they're curious about themselves. And they're like, oh, I didn't realize that this was an area of privilege I had, or I didn't realize that this is something that, you know, impacted other people or people on my team. And I get really excited and energized by it. That's rewarding because people are there and they're present and they're engaged and they're interested and they're curious and they want to know about themselves. And they want to learn more, and they're taking the information and they're using it. I love that part.
Yeah, because you get to see it kind of in real time.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just like this theoretical stuff we're talking about, but like people, like light bulbs are going off and people are like, wait, I hadn't even thought of this before.
Yes.
And really get to like do some of their own internal work. And you can see that kind of being triggered. It sounds
yes.
like. Yeah.
I love that. It brings me back to my therapy days.
Always. Like I think as psychologists and therapists, like that's just the way our brains work. I feel like I always find myself going back to that, even if that's not like the hat I'm wearing in a particular moment. We talked about challenges, like, you know, of working or kind of engaging these kinds of topics with folks who maybe don't have the training already and getting buy-in. Any other challenges that you would say kind of come up that you face in your role?
Having C-suite buy-in. I think that in any organization, any company, C-suite needs to be the face of DEI because people are constantly watching them, because they are in charge of the company. This is their baby, right? And I think oftentimes the work gets put on a different team, right? I'm on people ops. So there's sort of like a no org dev is taking care of it perspective. And I think it's not necessarily that we don't have the C-suite buy-in. I think it's the challenge of they are very, very busy. And so they want to delegate as much as possible. And it's just so important, right? And they have a lot of important things on their plate, and this is huge. Yeah. And I don't know that they necessarily see it as big as they see numbers, et cetera. I don't know what it's like to be in the C-suite. I have no idea. I can't say that I do know the experience, but I imagine that it's difficult. And so I think that getting that buy-in and getting them to sort of jump in and lead certain efforts, be the person to come and say, this is our new inclusion statement, and here's how we came up with it, right? And present it to the company. That would be amazing. So I think that is definitely a challenge, because when you don't have that buy-in, when they're not participating in the process, when it's simply delegated to you, the rest of the company is watching, and what they see is, this is another side project and I can participate if I want to, but I don't necessarily have to, as opposed to this is a core part of who we are as a company. And I'm the CEO and I'm saying that. And then I'm going to send out emails and I'm going to send out information and I'm going to remind people of certain things, you know, like it has a very different impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think maybe too, like if folks can see them actively being part of those conversations too, like, so, you know, supporting the teams, but also like, no, I'm doing this work too. Probably like drive home for folks like, oh, okay, like we're doing this. And we kind of need to, in order for us to be successful, like as a group.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to pass the baton over to Mike for the rest of these.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that last piece too, where it's almost, an angle of like modeling, strangely enough, too, right?
Yes.
You look to leaders to kind of model and sort of shape a little bit of, right, the culture and what it's like. And if they're not buying into and modeling that, then also, there's less of a, I mean, right, it just goes back to like therapy, like systems therapy, like family therapy to some extent, right?
Yep.
Sort of leader authoritative role to kind of like show that modeling to kind of like buy into some of this stuff. So yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to shift a little and we're going to talk a little bit more about for folks who are trying to explore this space career-wise. And I'll ask you a few questions around that. So, first we'll start off with what would be your advice to individuals that are passionate about DEIB and looking to secure some kind of formal role or position?
One, get educated. Get educated about yourself, get educated about DEI, get educated about other people, be ready for difficult work. The conversations that are going to be had are challenging. Be ready for pushback because you may experience that. Be ready to look at yourself in ways that might be uncomfortable. Get ready to make a lot of mistakes because you will. And also, that's okay, right? We have to learn ways of moving forward when we do make mistakes. Be willing to have very difficult conversations on challenging topics, and to gently challenge people, but know when that moment is appropriate, right? That when is it okay to challenge someone versus when is it going to shut someone down? Embrace ambiguity. We don't always have clear answers. In fact, in the psychology space, we often don't have clear answers. There may not be perfect answers to how do we approach X, Y, and Z task to help, improve inclusivity of the company. And so, it's about being comfortable with constant learning and development, willingness to make mistakes, willingness to learn from those mistakes. I think people ops is a good place to start because these sort of DEI roles within the context of organizations are newer. And we're starting to see them pop up more and more. And in organizational development, that's where it lies at my company. I don't have a ton of other organizational experience because I just moved into that from being a clinical psychologist. So I don't really know other spaces that would be good to jump into, but I would say people operations or HR, which is essentially the same thing, is probably a great place to start. And then get involved in any sort of inclusion efforts at the company, whether that be an employee resource group, whether that be, an inclusion council, diversity council, whatever efforts the company is making, jump in, because then there's sort of more visibility. You're able to get in there, get to know who's in that space, who's working in that space, learn what projects are being done, and jump in on that. And that's sort of how I did it, was like, who's doing this stuff? Who do I talk to? How do I sort of get into that, right? Like, and jump in on certain projects, express my own interest, and go from there.
Nice. Yeah, and I feel like some of that too, right, is kind of finding those connections, it sounds like.
Yeah, building relationships.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I mean, kind of related to that, how can individuals seek out mentorship from leaders in the space and, what did that look like for you?
Yeah, it looked like finding who was doing the work and building relationships with those people. And so, for me, it's my current boss. It was reaching out to her. It was, hey, how can I get involved? This is an area of passion for me. I'd really like to help. And at first it was just working on, so at the time I was doing some recruiting type things. And so I jumped in at first by helping out with some of those pieces. And then I joined the Inclusion Council and we wrote our diversity statement together, where, like I mentioned before, when we got the feedback from the whole company and we kind of put it together to put together a full-on inclusion statement. And now I'm on the organizational development team and I am partnering with her on these projects. So don't be afraid to reach out. I think people are very willing to help teach in this space, because those of us who are in it are pretty passionate about it and value it, and think, that the value of learning about this and the value of having people who are passionate about this, like I would never turn someone away who was interested, like ever, because I think, we could use allies in this space. So reach out, find out who's doing the work, develop those relationships.
Yeah, and maybe if I can like even double click more into that. So like,
Yeah.
you mentioned like building those relationships and like can you share maybe a little more like tactically like how you did that with your current boss, but at that point I imagine you weren't even closely reporting to her. What did those engagements look like? And what kind of conversations were you having? Because I also feel like with some of this stuff it feels so, and this is just speaking from my own like lived experience, like I it's so challenging to know exactly like am I doing this right? Like am I building this relationship correctly? Am I really doing this in a way that's going to lead me to transition into this role that I wasn't hired for? Even though like it's possible, you see people do it all the time, right?
Yeah, it's totally possible. How did I interface with Indigo? Well, um, I got a little lucky because on two fronts. One, I started building the relationship with Indigo because she's on People Ops, I'm on People Ops, and I saw her at our weekly, like we interface together, just because we were all part of the People Ops team, even though I wasn't doing that job or any of the inclusion stuff. However, she would talk about what she was doing. And so anytime she talked about something that she was interested in, I would say, Indigo, that's amazing. Tell me more, right? Like, I want to hear about what you're doing. Because all of her projects were so exciting. And then from there, I think the other piece was my boss was going on maternity leave and she needed me to jump in to help with some projects. And I said, and I actually had told my boss, like, I would love to be involved in the Inclusion Council. I would love to be involved in the inclusion stuff. Here's the experience that I have from my prior jobs. Like, we were doing trainings like every other week, pretty much, at my last job. And so I explained to her that, and I explained to her, like, here's where I think I could add value. Here's where I want to learn more. Here's why I want to be involved. And so when she went on maternity leave, she got me involved in this project, with Indigo. And, from there, it was asking a lot of questions. I think the other piece is we talked about our relationship. She's multiracial, my boss, and I'm white. And so we talked about our different like perceptions and views, and lived experiences in regards to the DEI space. And me being mindful of my own privilege and coming into this space. Like for me, you mentioned, Mike, something about like, am I doing this right?
Mhm.
And so we'll talk about that, and I'll be like, hey, sometimes I feel like the well-intentioned white person trying to push these DEI efforts where people aren't receptive. I don't want to be that person. I want to promote, I want to use my privilege to elevate other voices. I want to help in any way that I can, and also don't want to push too hard, if that's something that's going to be received unwell, right? And so being mindful of my own impact. So I think when you have those conversations, having a little bit of understanding of like the different identities between you and that person you're reaching out to, I think that helped us get started too, because our conversations weren't just, it started with, right, like I'm so excited about these projects you're working on, tell me more, to, hey, now I get to jump onto a project with you, to, hey, now let's talk about our identities and how that impact us together in the work that we're doing. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's so fascinating, right? Because you're almost the skills that you're almost hoping to sort of teach outside of sort of both of you in your relationship is kind of what you want the culture of the organization to be like. And it's
Yeah.
almost like it's having to start sort of like within yourselves and sort of to sort of almost build it, be able to build that out
Yeah.
to some extent. And I also hear like a little bit of like managing up to your manager and sort of like, highlighting those opportunities, why you're great for it, and selling yourself a little bit, right, to that point.
Yeah.
Um, all things that I think are difficult for a lot of people.
And if I
Myself
could,
included. Yeah.
yeah, if I could ask a follow-up question too, like something I've thought about before is, so, you express interest to the people who are doing the work at your company, like that you would like to be involved in and wanting to do. Is there a line? Where is the line between like doing that and seeming like you don't want to do your job that you have been hired to do? Like, how do you, like, not like, oh, I really took this job so that I could get, transition into this other one. And maybe you did have some like long-term strategy that you knew about, maybe that was, but like, do you, is that something to think about or consider, or how to navigate, like how do I seem like I do, not seem but show that you care about the work you're doing, but you have these additional interests or passions or kind of long-term professional development goals without sounding like you don't want to do your current job?
That's a great question, because when I came into the company, I didn't want to do recruiting. I wanted to do organizational development and all that that entailed. And I knew that from the get-go, and I told them that in my interview.
Hmm.
I also came in from a pretty humble stance of saying, I have no business experience. Tell me about how you see these areas of HR. So literally our director of HR walked me through like these different areas of HR that he had on a PowerPoint slide. And I just listened, and he told me everything about these different areas. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I asked him, I said, I think my strengths lie in organizational development. Like these things that you say are part of this, whether that be DEI initiatives, whether that be running our internship program or doing leadership trainings, teaching people about emotional intelligence, right? Those are my forte. I can do emotional intelligence all day. I asked him, I said, where do you think it makes sense for me to start, knowing that I don't have any business like experience whatsoever, right? I've been working in college counseling. I've been working at big healthcare organizations. And he said, I think you should start in recruiting. And I think that because you will learn so much about business and the organization. And I said, great, I am more than willing to do that. And then I put my heart in it, right? And I said, let me learn as much as I possibly can. And it was a great space to be, actually, because not to recommend that everybody start in recruiting, but it was a good place to be because one, I had the interpersonal skills to do it, right, from being a therapist, but two, because I learned about all sorts of different jobs at the company. So I got a really good understanding. And so it was like my mission during that time to really understand, what do people do at this company, right? And to learn about people. And that gave me like a kickoff to also ask for extra projects, right? But it's like, if you're doing your job, whatever it is that you were hired into, and you're putting your heart and your energy and effort into it, and you ask for extra projects on top of it, you're not going to look like you don't want to be doing what you're doing, right? And so to some extent, depending on the company and how the company sees it, I didn't find it difficult to have a transparent conversation about, this is where I want to start and this is where I want to grow. Like I'm open to your feedback that you think I would go like do really well here, right? And also, you now know that this is my growth track. This is where I want to be, right? And those conversations should be happening with managers all the time, right? So even if you start as something in HR or wherever, it's okay to have those growth conversations. Here's where I'd like to grow. I'd really like to get involved in DEI work in addition to what I'm doing, right? So you're not making it sound like you don't want to do these other things. It's just, this is my passion and this is how I see my career moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And like you're saying, those growth conversations should be happening anyway. So
Yeah.
it should be kind of a a natural conversation to be having.
Hopefully. Not
Yeah.
all managers naturally have those conversations, right? Like, and it's okay to bring it up with the manager too, right? Like, so if your manager isn't asking you to have these growth conversations, say, hey, can we have a growth conversation? I'd love to talk about my career path.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, that's a good segue to the next one that we had on here, right around sort of what are some common career paths for individuals in DEI. I know you kind of walked us through a little bit of yours. What else have you seen either at your company? What have you learned from sort of the industry, or just anything else in relation to your experience around it?
I'm gonna be honest. Well, I've been honest this whole time, but um, that was a hard question for me. So when I was reviewing the questions, because I'm so new to tech, I don't know. My trajectory was starting in recruiting, and then moving over to organizational development, and organizational development is where DEI initiatives lie. I know that my boss got a master's in, I believe it was in industrial organizational psychology. And so I think some people will go into that space and do sort of like organizational psychology backgrounds, get those kinds of backgrounds. Our audience is obviously therapists in tech, or people who are aiming to be therapists, etc. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for it in clinical spaces too. I think the folks, like when I was working in college counseling, anybody who had a passion for it, our council was open to them joining. So, if there is an inclusion council or an ERG or anything where you work, right? Or look for workspaces that have those things so that you can get involved, because you can transition from anywhere to doing that work, or you can do a job and still be on an inclusion council doing that work simultaneously.
Thanks. And yeah, for those ERG is Employee Resource Group. And
Yes.
an example would be something like, I know we have like Latinat, so that would be for all Latinx individuals and things like that.
Yep.
Cool. What do you think are some of the things that companies are doing well in relation to DEIE? And then what do you think are some blind spots or things that are currently missing? I know you touched on this a little bit earlier on with sort of like the sort of metrics that were maybe being aimed to be hit at, for example. But yeah, anything else you could share in relation to that?
Yeah, definitely trying to hit metrics without doing anything internally. It's hard to say, right? Because I don't know exactly the internal functionings of companies, but from a more generic standpoint, what I can say, always a challenge when it comes to, I think companies right now are mindful about DEI and want to show that they're DEI mindful. And so when it comes to a Heritage Month, for example, Hispanic Heritage Month just ended October 15th, right? They'll put stuff out there. And this was a challenge for us too, as an organization, that we talked a lot about, like, how do we do this? Because one, we want to recognize these months, right? We want to recognize these important events. We want to recognize Juneteenth. We want to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, which also just passed, right? How do we do that internally instead of just putting out a post on social media to say, hey, it's Indigenous Peoples Day and we're celebrating, right? Because I think a lot of companies will try and make it look on the surface that they're doing things in the DEI space, but nothing's happening internally, right? And if you're not doing anything internally, it's kind of fake to put it out there externally, right? Like, okay, but what are you actually doing? Are you just putting out a post? So, and then another thing that we're mindful of, and I don't know how much other companies are doing this, but is we don't want to tokenize employees in the process, right? So some of those posts you'll see like tokenized employee on Hispanic Heritage Month, right? Get posted on the company website. Not great. So, I think there are definitely things out there that are not, that don't look good. And I'm always asking, what are we doing internally that's reflecting anything that's getting posted externally? And is this an accurate depiction of the company? Because if I post a picture of all 5 Latinx individuals at the company, and then it makes it look like we have this big population or representative population, and then they come in and it was like, oh, actually that was all 5 people, and this is not the numbers at my company, I'm just throwing it out there as an example. But then you get into this company and you're like, wait, but I thought that it was more diverse, right? And so I think companies can have a tendency of like posting things out there that makes them look more diverse than they are. It's maybe not an actual representation of what's happening internally. They're trying to put things out there externally, but they're not doing the internal work. C-suite's not involved, right? They want to hand it off to someone else. Someone else is trying to do the work, but not really getting full buy-in. That's I think some of that. And then the things that I think one of the questions too was like, what are companies doing well, right?
Yeah.
I've seen websites where they are very transparent about their numbers. And they've split it between leaders and individual contributors, and who's in which roles, and then what that looks like across the years. I love that transparency, because I can look at that company and I can say, wow, they really have not made progress, but they're willing to put that out there. And that's a level of vulnerability that shows that they're willing to work on it, right? Granted, if it's 10 years and there's absolutely no change, it's probably problematic. But I actually have seen that on some websites and doing some research for our own website and what can we put out there. And I value that piece. I think that's done well. And I think when there is attachment to here's what we're doing within the company to make changes, and there's specific bullet points, right? Like there are action items. I think that is when companies do it well. So
Yeah, and I mean that kind of sounds like a talk the talk and walk the walk kind of deal a little
yes,
bit.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah, and especially that, I mean, I've seen so many transparency reports, and I think I never really know, you know, to like what does that mean, right? Like I guess
yeah,
for you, it almost sounds like it's like one, the level of transparency shows a level of vulnerability where it shows there's at least some work going on internally around it.
yeah.
And then secondly, almost like ensuring like that there is actual action items tied to make an impact on those numbers.
Yeah. And hey, I mean, maybe that's my bias. Maybe I'm assuming that if someone's willing to put the numbers out there, that they're doing something to change them, right? I am hopeful that is the case.
Yeah. Nice. I know we're coming to time, so I'm just gonna jump to our last question here, and
Yeah.
we can close it out. Yeah, so how do your intersectional identities influence the work that you do and the impact that you have in your role?
Okay. So as a white person in a DEI space, I'm very mindful of my own privilege and potential for impact, both in positive and in potentially negative ways. And so I mentioned earlier, like I really want to use my privilege to elevate other people. I also want to be very cautious of not speaking for anybody else. And I think there are other pieces of my identities that aren't privileged, being Jewish, being female, being an individual with chronic health concerns. Some of those not being even visible identities, right? So I am mindful of these, these identities that at different points in my life can have different levels of salience. And I think that having, areas in which I do lack privilege has provided some insight into experiences of transgenerational trauma, discrimination, prejudice, feeling attacked, feeling othered, feeling like people don't understand my experience. And I would say, those experiences have taught me the value, both, and I think mostly clinically is where I've done the most work, is really like not over identifying with individuals, and being able to lean on some of those experiences for empathy, for understanding. And I mean, I think that the biggest piece and the most salient piece is like being very mindful of being white in a DEI space. Because I am, and like I said from the beginning, I'm not an expert. I don't want to portray myself as the expert. I am in learning all the time. I am open to feedback all the time. I want to know about myself. I want to know about how I'm impacting other people, because I know that, even by the color of my skin and my privilege, I might be perceived one way. I might have an impact that I don't intend. And that impact is important to me. So my identities are very much intertwined into the work that I do. And like I said, I have these conversations with my boss. And then I also have individuals outside of work that I can have conversations with who also do DEI work. And I think it's good to have like a diverse group of people you can talk to and have perspectives on, because I have a number of friends that work in this space from various backgrounds, and they all have different perspectives. And so I think having that core group of people that I can talk to about my own identities and my experiences, and how those lived experiences impact me and how that impacts my work is very important, right? Like, yeah. And I just do a lot of reading also. So yeah, I'm almost done. I'm reading The Sum of Us right now. I'm almost done. It's actually really good. Highly recommend. Oh gosh.
Great.
Sorry.
No,
My phone's ringing.
No, thank you
And
so
it's
much.
silenced, but it's ringing anyway.
Um, yeah, no, thank you so much for being so candid and open with us. And, I personally get a sense like your company, I would imagine, is very lucky to have you doing this kind of work from
Thank you.
the little I know about you, even so far. So it's just really cool to kind of like hear that and kind of like see that in action in the space. Because you're right. I don't know. It seems like it's a big challenge in sort of balancing those two spaces, both the business objectives and the growth around what a company is looking for, while also balancing the things that we hold sort of so personal to us and to who we are and to what employees bring into work every day.
Yep.
Right, that's always in there. And I think a lot of times like we try to keep them two separate, but there's no real way to do that as long as you have individuals working together, for an extended period of time every day, day in, day out.
Yeah, you don't get to leave your identities at the door. um
Yeah.
which makes things challenging, right? Like you can't just I can't just be like, okay, when I walk into the office, I'm no longer X, Y, and Z. It's not possible, right? So we have to learn to be aware of those things and be aware of our biases and be aware of how that impacts us, and it does, right? And when something happens in the news, right? Like DACA just got shut down, which was incredibly upsetting, right? Not to like bring in politics, but I had a lot of undocumented students, right? And so you need to be aware of like what's happening in the world and how that's going to impact people walking in, right? And how it's impacting me. I'm like, am I super upset about this? Because if I am super upset about this, which I am, and I walk into work and there's someone else there that I know is going to be super upset about this, like, one, we can lean on empathy. but two, I'm not going to go and start like mouthing off and being like, oh my God, right? Like I want to be mindful of what are their needs in that moment, right? Even though I want to be angry and yell and be like, this is so stupid.
Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing like, and I think, you know, like personally, something that I've probably up until like George Floyd, I think I'd been used to things happening in the world, but at work, those things not being it feels like those things aren't relevant or important to the people that you're working with, and so you keep those things to yourself, you know, like, oh, I'm upset about this thing going on, but like that's not something that the workplace is prepared to address, or like even like I don't know if I want them to, because I don't know what people are going to say, and that might be even more upsetting. And I think since George Floyd, it seems like I've had experiences where coworkers, leaders have, you know, reached out or done things that feel like genuinely like, okay, you care about me as a person and how I feel, even though this particular topic maybe doesn't exactly map on to the work that I'm doing here, but you know, are valuing my, you know, feeling my whole being, right? And so that can be very welcoming and making folks feel like valued and accepted and all of those things. I also just kind of wanted to quickly mention the point you made about you know, talking about your intersectionalities and how, you know, regardless, I think, of our intersectionalities, we all have our biases and blind spots, and just being open to continuously learning and not getting kind of too caught up in this, like, I'm an expert about this, but there may be, but there's like so many other topics and groups that you can't know everything about. And so just kind of being having that humility to say like, hey, I know some things about this, but I don't know much at all about this group or this population, and really being willing to be a student. I love that you brought that up. We want to be mindful of your time and your day. It's Monday, so you know that's not always the most fun day of the week, but thanks for taking some time to talk with us.